everyone. So we are going to move on to chapter 7, which is all about bringing species back from the brink. So we're trying to figure out what to do if a species is really close to extinction, and we're trying to do everything in our power to keep that from happening. So a set of really important tools are establishing and reinforcing populations. So we don't want the species to become extinct in the wild, or if it is extinct in the wild, we want to reestablish populations in their native habitat. So this includes things like reintroduction programs, which is releasing individuals at a suitable site within the species' historic range where it no longer occurs. So when a species is extirpated from an area, reintroduction is putting them back in that place so that they're no longer extirpated. A reinforcement program is releasing individuals into an existing population to increase its size and gene pool. So if a population gets very small, we might want to add more individuals to either increase genetic diversity, which if you remember was called genetic rescue, or to increase that population's size to help guard against some of those problems with small populations. The third thing we can do is an introduction program, and this is releasing individuals at a suitable site outside of the species' historic range. This is relatively uncommon, but this is something we might want to do if the species' historic range is no longer suitable and it's not possible to reintroduce it into a place where it used to exist. Reasons for introduction programs could be that there's a lot of invasive species that, or a particular invasive species that the endangered species cannot live with. We might want to put that species, introduce it into an area that doesn't have that invasive species. So we'll talk about that example. Climate change is another example of when introduction programs might be something we want to consider. Head starting is a fourth tool, and this is rearing young in captivity to increase survival and then releasing them. So I want to give you an example. Sometimes reintroductions have huge positive impacts on communities. And we've mentioned this before, but this is probably one of the most well-known, most dramatically successful reintroductions that totally restructured an ecosystem and made it work in a way that it did historically but wasn't working before the reintroduction. And so this is gray wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone National Park and the areas surrounding it. In the 1920s, the government actually sponsored a program to eradicate gray wolves. Wolves have a really bad rap, and they do take some livestock. And part of this is they didn't think about any ways to allow the wolves to coexist with livestock and take protective measures to reduce the amount of conflict between gray wolves and people. They just chose, they thought the best way to go was just to eradicate gray wolves so that ranchers didn't have to worry about them taking their livestock. So wolves, we've talked about keystone species and how predators sometimes act as really important keystone species. Gray wolves are one of these, and because of their ecological role, the national park decided to reintroduce them in the 1990s. This shows a graph of the wolf population and the number of wolves killed and the number of domestic animals killed. So we can see that in the late 1980s, there weren't wolves. There were obviously not any wolves killed because there weren't any wolves to kill. And there weren't any domestic animals killed by wolves. And so you can see the blue shows the increase in the wolf population size, and it peaked in the early 2000s, and it's relatively steady at this point. And we can see that as the wolf population increased, the number of domestic animals killed by wolves increased. They've started to take more measures to reduce the conflict between wolves and livestock. So without killing wolves, reduce the number of domestic animals killed. And we'll talk more about that when we get to protected areas, and we'll talk more about human-wildlife conflict. And you can see that the number of wolves killed increased as well. This shows the food web and the importance of wolves to the food web. So wolves are really important at regulating elk, but also coyotes. Wolves are dominant to coyotes, and so coyotes get pushed out of certain areas when wolves are present. Wolves' preferred prey is elk, but you can see while wolves only directly impact coyotes and elk, there are a lot of other indirect effects that are very important. So we've talked about trophic cascades before and what happens when you remove a top predator. So removing the wolves changed all of these different interactions. So when they put the wolves back, wolves started eating elk again, but they also started scaring elk. So elk behave differently when these big predators are around. So the elk, by being scared, but also by being eaten, means that they eat less woody plants, which impacts stream morphology. So when they're eating less woody plants, then there's more plants to stabilize the stream banks and reduce erosion. We get more berries, which is good for bears. We get more birds that like these different plants, and we get more beavers because they also need woody plants. By suppressing coyotes, it reduced the amount of predation on pronghorn and small mammals, so we get more pronghorn and small mammals. And we also get more scavengers because there are more elk carcasses around. So this is data that was collected on that. You can see that the x-axis is the timeline from 1990 through 2010 on all of these graphs. And we can see, first we see the wolves go up. As the wolves go up, the elk go down. Willow is a type of tree, and we can see that as the elk go down, the willow go up. The amount of browsing goes down, and so that browsing is herbivores eating leaves off of woody plants. As that occurs, we get taller aspens, which is a type of tree, and we get more beavers, more cottonwoods, that's another tree, and the bison start to be doing better as well. So there are all these cascading effects of adding one species, but it happens to be a keystone species, back into this ecosystem. It changes the dynamics of the whole ecosystem. So not every reintroduction does that, but this is the type of thing that a reintroduction could do. So when we decide that we need to do a reintroduction, what considerations should we make? What do you think? An important one is cost. Reintroductions can be very expensive. They did an analysis and they showed that captive rearing of orangutans cost 12 times more than preserving the habitat. So in general, the best thing to do is to not have to do reintroductions. So we want to keep species from being extirpated so we don't need to do reintroductions, because it's much, much more expensive to do the reintroduction than to protect the habitat in the first place and try to make sure that that species doesn't need to be reintroduced. A very important consideration is which site to pick. Right now, I'm involved in a project that's considering reintroducing southern crawfish frogs to Louisiana. We think that they've been extirpated, and one of the big things we're going to need to do is figure out what site to pick. We need to know what resources the species need, what makes a site suitable, what are the differences between places that the species does live and the places the species doesn't live that are nearby. We need to figure out what those differences are to pick the best site, because we want it to have the highest probability of success because it's so expensive. We also need to think about human-wildlife conflict and stakeholder concerns. Stakeholders are people that live in the area, and something about their reintroduction might affect how they live or their businesses, economics, things like that. One way the Endangered Species Act deals with this is by having experimental essential and non-essential populations. So an experimental population is one where a reintroduction is taking place. And if it's deemed essential, then that endangered species is protected very strongly under the Endangered Species Act. If it's considered non-essential, this is a way to do a reintroduction, and if the human-wildlife conflict or stakeholder concerns are too high, then they don't have to keep the population there. It's kind of, as it says, an experiment to see how this is going to go. And you can imagine human-wildlife conflict could be very high with something like a wolf, but when we're talking about the frogs that we might want to reintroduce, the human-wildlife conflict will probably be very low. Disease screening. We need to make sure that the individuals we release aren't going to introduce any diseases, or that our introduced animals aren't going to come into contact with any problematic diseases. You have to think about whether we need to acclimate the individuals to a new area. Do the individuals have the skills to survive? If they've been raised by people, do they know what to do to find food, to find shelter, to reproduce? All of these things.